How long should a comic book page take to complete? This is actually quite a nuanced, detailed, multi-layered question, but luckily it's one that I'm kind of interested in, and I spent a fair bit of my career drawing comics in different industries around the world, and in this video what I want to do is try and unpack this age-old question: how long should I take to draw my comic book page? Let's get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex channel, where we help you draw cool stuff from your imagination to get to a professional level, to embrace the challenge of drawing, and more specifically what I'm about is mastering the craft of line and color illustration, which is something that we use a lot in comic books. Now, the reason that this is a complicated issue is because comics are many things, and there are stories of people creating huge numbers of comic book pages. Osamu Tezuka, who is considered to be one of the grandfathers of manga, was doing hundreds and hundreds of pages a month. Famously, Jack Kirby, who created half of the Marvel universe that now gets made into all of these films, would often be said to have drawn or penciled 16 pages a day. And in other areas where you might have something like the French comic book industry, or even the old newspaper strip artists like Prince Valiant, Hal Foster from the 20s and 30s in America, would be creating very detailed pages over an entire week. So there's no real answer to this question. It's really about the level of quality that you can expect to achieve in a particular amount of time. With comics, the trick is, and often the curse is, that I think you'll find that every comic book creator could do better if they had more time on their page. And to a certain degree, working in comics is always a game of compromise, where you're trying to do the best job you can in a given amount of time. So I thought a lot about how best to answer this question. And what I'm going to do is assume a few things. The first thing I'm going to assume is that you are a solo creator. So you're not someone working in a production chain where you're penciling and then someone else is going to ink it, someone's going to color it, someone's going to letter it. You are the sole creator. And we're also going to assume that you don't have any assistants. Again, a lot of those situations where you have manga artists who are creating hundreds or thousands of pages a month, they're a small part in the production process. They're often guiding it, but there are teams and rooms and office buildings full of people who are actually drawing and creating that. So again, we're assuming that you or I, whoever we're talking about here, is a solo creator. We're actually doing everything. And what we're trying to answer is really, how much can we expect to get done in a given amount of time? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about different industries because I think that is an interesting way to sort of view it. Now, I think the three industries that we typically tend to group comics into would be the Japanese manga industry, the Western sort of superhero / indie image comics industry, and also you have the European comic book industry. Now, again, in the European industry, typically you're going to have larger albums that have a larger number of panels per page. So typically you're dealing with something that is in the range of 8 to 12 panels per page in a European comic, again, like this one that I drew, the Pinocchio book. Now, Western comics, typically, I'm assuming that the Western audience that you're speaking English, or you have a good understanding of Western comics. Typically, I'm assuming there you're dealing with that sort of 3 to 5, maybe 6 panels per page. Now, manga, again, can sort of, break down differently. People often assume it's sort of like, quicker art. There's a range of different sort of, styles of manga, right? This is, Osamu Tezuka. Again, and you can see that there's actually quite a few, panels per page. You're not dealing with like just one or two big action panels. There's quite a range in the amount of detail you might have. You can have your sort of classic Akira Toriyama sort of page. And again, it's that sort of 5 panels per page. A lot of them, don't have super detailed backgrounds, though a lot of them focus on character work. But again, it's very hard to kind of make, again, my point is it's actually quite challenging to make industry sort of specific generalizations about how long a page should take because, it's from this industry or that industry. Again, you have something like, Akira, which is a manga, and, it's very, very detailed, right? A lot of work went into this. And again, there were assistants obviously involved in the creation of that. And again, people often assume that, you have your sort of typical, French comics are always these kind of, typical big albums. Again, this is Siegfried by, Alex Alice. And, this is often what people are imagining when they're sort of thinking about, French comics. You got like lots of pages, quite detailed, lots of backgrounds on, every page. This is a really, really beautifully illustrated book. But, there are many, many different styles of French and European comics. There's obviously a lot of cross-pollination from styles. Here's a book by Cyril Pedrosa, and it's very much in that sort of mix of French manga style, right? So it has a lot of the sort of structural elements of manga, i.e. there's a whole pile of pages. It's just in black and white, and it sort of looks like it has a similar number of panels, right? So much less panels than your sort of, big European book. But again, we need to sort of move a little bit beyond saying like all European French books are like, Tintin or something, and they've got 14 panels per page. There's a huge variety of comics out there that, again, you can get inspiration from and sort of look at how long they sort of took, right? Again, another thing that, again, people often don't sort of look at if they're looking at sort of French books, is that there are things that are, again, a lot more sort of stylized. They still might have a lot of panels per page, but again, the art is simpler, and I'm assuming it takes a little bit less time to produce than, something with all of those kind of like detailed backgrounds. Again, this one is by Carrascote and Hubert. Again, terrible pronunciation. My apologies, but this is an amazing looking book. Again, Hubert is one of the best colorists in the world, I think, and just does an amazing job. But so again, there's a large variety of different styles that you can sort of look at and draw from. And it's really important to understand that we need to move forward the idea of manga is like this, Western comics are like that, French comics are like this. Okay, it's complicated. There's lots of different options out there. And I think the best way to sort of break this down is to think about, if we set a certain amount of time, how much can you expect both as a professional and as a beginner to be able to achieve in that set amount of time? And we'll start with 1 hour. So, do you think you could do something in 1 hour as a comic book page? Now, we know that we can, right? There's often 24-hour comic book challenges, and people are able to kind of, really smash through that and, try and create a 22-page comic. And, that's obviously going to, roughly lay out to about, an hour per page. But what you're going to get if you look at sort of that sort of 1 hour or even sort of 2 hours per page is something where you have an extreme sort of stylistic advantage somehow, right? You're dealing with much simpler art. You might have art that's more sort of looks a little bit more indie, independent. And again, it is possible to create art like that, comics like that. But in that case, you're probably going to be dealing with something where you're focusing more on story versus like creating really, really pretty pictures. You're not going to get a huge amount of, backgrounds and detailed art at that sort of 1 or even to 2 hour sort of range. You're really going to be sort of rushing. But, certainly, I think a lot of professional artists probably, if you really practiced that 1 hour and you kind of really made it quite efficient, if you were a professional artist, you could probably do something pretty good, But again, it would be something that was heavily stylized in some way. As a beginner, I think it can be actually a really fun idea to spend 1 hour per page, because just that, pressure that gets taken off you, the expectation sort of gets lifted off you to create something pretty, right? And you get to focus on the story and the act of simply making a comic, which I think is probably more important than the art in the beginning. So the second sort of tier here that I think is important is the kind of 3 hour, right? Maybe like sort of 3 to 4 hour sort of range, but more in that kind of like 3 hour sort of time frame. And again, when I'm talking about this, I really mean that you're working really hard. You're going to have to be spending all your time and all your focus of that 3 hours just drawing comics and making comics, right? You're not going to be able to, be watching a movie and doing it at the same time. It's going to take full focus. But I think it is possible for a professional to do something in 3 hours that kind of start to approach that professional level. And I think, again, there's probably a lot of good examples of professional artists doing this. If you're just starting out and you're really trying to, again, work on the artistry and the craft of a comic book page, if you're trying to attack that 3 hour per page thing, again, you're probably going to fall into heavy stylization, or you're going to be in real struggle town. It's quite challenging to practice or build your skills if you're in that sort of 3 hour range. Really, at that point, it's more about production. You're able to sort of capitalize on an existing skill set and, put all of your energy into a certain amount of, stuff that you can do in 3 hours. But again, you will find that people can do stuff if they have a lot of experience in that time frame. If you're just starting out, they'll realize that's going to be a big challenge to create something, even half decent. Just quickly, if you want to learn a little bit about my journey from becoming someone who was not good at drawing at all to becoming a professional comic book artist and then concept artist, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. The link will be in the description. I talk a little bit about my journey going from someone who, again, just was completely terrible at drawing to working in comics professionally. So the next sort of tier that I think is probably important is the 4 to 5 hour page. Now, this is where I think you're probably going to find that professional artists can actually sort of create something good, right? A real pro is going to be able to produce quite a decent page in that range. But again, we're probably going to be dealing with something that is in the 3 to 5 panel per page range. So not one of these large European books, with 12 panels per page with interesting designs that are, fully fleshed out, backgrounds, lots of rendering, all that stuff. But certainly a lot of Western, sort of American-based comic book artists are probably working in that time frame. Once they're in flow, once they're working on a project, once everything's kind of designed, right? I think probably a lot of pages get done in that sort of 4 to 5 hour page range. But again, if you're beginning, I think it is worth, especially if you are sort of trying to work towards getting work in the American system where you might have to do a page a day. I think it is really good to just kind of work at that 4 to 5 hours per page and just sort of see how good you can get. But realize in the beginning, that is going to be a struggle as well, right? There's not a huge difference between 3 and 5 hours for the beginner. But for a professional, that extra sort of 2 hours is often all they need to kind of just get to that next level and start producing work that is, pretty good, right? Again, keep in mind, I'm being pretty aggressive with these time targets, and I can't stress enough that I'm talking about focus. So, it's almost that sort of 4 to 5 hours is for a lot of people, that is their whole day, right? If you're just messing around for the rest of the day, that probably is a full day of work. But again, it's a good range, and I think that 4 to 5 hours is really the first step at which you're going to be able to produce stuff that is going to be able to look really good, right? Once you step below that, it's going to be a challenge, right? You're going to need to stylize things and really work at it. But 4 to 5 hours, you can do something good. And if you're a beginner, don't expect it to be good in the beginning, but if you keep practicing that 4 to 5 hour page, eventually you'll get better and better and better, and you'll get to a point where, again, that will start to look like professional work. The next stage, the next tier that I have is 1 day. Now, again, as I said, if you're looking at the previous tier, which is 4 to 5 hours, for a lot of people that is going to be a whole day. But again, that sort of 1 day, right, and just sort of saying as a schedule, right, we're doing, 1 day per page, is probably looking at more about like 6 to 7 hours. I'm of the opinion that you don't really have more than 6 or 7 hours of actual work in you per day. When you're dealing with comic books, there are a lot of really menial tasks that you can do, as I often say. Doing the inking might be something you can do with your brain a little bit switched off. So again, you might be able to spend, maybe 4 hours on really solid kind of like drawing and preparing the image, and then you can kind of turn your brain off a little bit for doing some inking and coloring, right? Because those don't use the same amount of mental bandwidth as the drawing, from my experience. But again, once you're at that 1 day range, I think you have a lot of flexibility, and I think you find a lot of sort of those 3 to 5 panel per page Western comics. This is what professionals are able to, create good work within that sort of time frame. Again, I still think you're probably going to find that the artists, no matter what industry they're coming from or whatever, if they're in that sort of, if they're in that kind of 1 day range, that you're still not going to see the most detailed art, right? You're still not going to probably see the most kind of crazy, amazing panels. The artists that are typically known for being, like really, really good as artists, having very, highly detailed, polished work, are often, on a different schedule. They're not producing 1 page per day, but again, it is possible. If you're a beginner and you're trying to attack that 1 day per page, again, there's probably a reason for that, and it's because you're trying to get into a particular industry whereby you need to produce a particular amount of work. If you are trying to really, really push your art, right, and become one of those artists who's known for having very detailed art, very highly polished art, lots of backgrounds, I think you're probably better off spending more time in the beginning to focus on quality. But realize that, again, what you're sort of trying to aim for is, again, that sort of 1 page per day. It's a really good benchmark, right? A lot of stuff is possible in, 1 day per page, but again, you're still dealing with some degree of having to compromise, right? Because you have to imagine that in many cases, people are working in production schedules where they can't spend every single day. Stuff happens. You have to go to appointments. You have a meeting. Something happens. There might be days where you need to write the story, or right. There's other stuff that sort of will come up that will throw you off. And so often, people aren't often actually spending 1 day per page. You often have to get it a little bit sort of more compressed than that. To make sure that you're over the long period, right, over the months and months and months, that you consistently produce a certain number of pages per month. But again, 1 day is a really, really good place to start, I think, for everyone, unless you're trying to create work that is a lot more detailed, right? Again, you're trying to be someone who's known for having really, really amazing art, which again is not the goal of all people who are working in comics, because in many cases, especially if you're a solo creator, working on the story is often far, far more important. That's the thing that will get you known as a creator versus, just pretty pictures. But if you do, I think, again, realize that a lot of the most sort of amazing, highly detailed artists aren't actually creating 1 page per day, especially if they're doing penciling, inking, and coloring as well. But again, it is possible if you sort of embrace the efficiencies of doing all those things at once. Again, lots of people pencil, just do the pencils for 1 page per day. But again, that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you being a solo creator and sort of more or less doing most of it. The next tier is 2 days. What can we imagine that we could reasonably create in 2 days? Well, again, as I said, I think this is where you're going to see someone who is trying to create very, very highly detailed pages. They're going to be able to, a professional is going to be able to create a really, really nice Western style page in 2 days. And I think that's a really good place to sort of imagine yourself being if you're trying to work and get really, really highly detailed amounts of work. Again, there's a lot of other things that come into this. If you're spending that long on a page, you have to sort of figure out how you're going to make money, because you're going to find that if someone's doing 1 page per day, they're kind of making twice as much money. So you really have to aggressively pursue higher page rates and a different sort of tier within the industry if you're sort of trying to create art that's a lot more detailed and takes more than sort of 1 day per page. I still think that at 2 days per page, I still think that you're going to struggle to create big European style pages with a crazy amount of detail, lots of backgrounds, 12 panels per page. I think that's quite a challenge at sort of 2 days. But for the Western sort of market, again, I think it's very possible to create really, really high level professional work. And again, I think that if you're a beginner and you're really trying to make a statement with your art, in the beginning, just practicing that 2 days per page is going to give you a lot of freedom to kind of experiment, correct mistakes, spend time on construction, make sure you have backgrounds, right? Make sure everything's right. It gives you a little bit more breathing room to make sure that you kind of create art that has a lot of impact and detail. There's a lot of possibility there. And again, if you carry that across the year and you consistently create work at that rate, you're still going to be able to create quite a large amount of work per year. Now, I haven't talked a lot about sort of the manga style of art here, but if you are just going for that sort of manga style, again, I think that a lot of those pages seem to be sort of done in about sort of 3 hours, right, or 4 hours. And I think that is even if you are sort of like a solo creator, right, you're going to have to hit that range, probably go pretty hard and pretty aggressive, and really just sort of try and figure out how you can get something happening in that sort of amount of time. I'd probably say the upper limit is going to be about a day per page if you're aggressively pursuing creating, sort of large, your large sort of books like a tankobon, or again, similar to something like this, right? You're probably not going to have a day per page to create something like that. It's probably going to be less, right? Multiple pages per day or something like that. But again, the thing there, and the reason I sort of talk about the style is, once you get into style and once you really get into the efficiencies of style and the simple ways you can draw, you can really crank out a lot of pages in a short amount of time and still tell really, really impressive stories. I think if you're just a solo creator, right, and you don't have assistants, I still think you're going to struggle to make something, at your sort of Otomo Akira level in under a day, right? I think it's going to take you at least that amount of time, maybe a little bit more. Those are very detailed pages. There's some of them that are crazy, right? And that just takes a lot of time to draw if you don't have assistants. So the next tier is the 3 days per page. And this is where I think that if you're a sort of a professional, you're going to be able to create an absolutely amazing, awesome Western 3 to 5 panel page in 3 days. The problem you're going to have is less a matter of what can you do in that amount of time. It's more a matter of, like, in the Western publishing industry, it's very tricky to make money if you're taking that long per page, because people just expect a certain amount of sort of content per year, and the industry kind of rates are sort of set around that. I think that once you get to this 3 day range, I think you could also look at your professional, French, European comic book artists who are working in that 8 to 12 panel per page range, being able to start to do something. I think that it's probably going to be very challenging to create a professional French bande dessinée, album, big page in less than 3 days, right? That's sort of been my experience of it, and typically, again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but typically the schedule is you kind of get a week. You get about sort of 5 days from a publishing schedule. And again, your job is to kind of do the best you can do in that amount of time to compete in the market. As a beginner, if you're trying to target that 3 days per page, I think that, again, this is where you're going to be able to have plenty of room to breathe, plenty of room to make mistakes, plenty of room to play around, and it might be worth experimenting to just see what you can do in that amount of time. If you're a beginner and you're trying to hit the level of quality on and scale of a French comic book page in 3 days, I think it's going to be struggle town. I think you're really, really going to struggle to create a competitive, high quality, highly detailed looking page that's going to compete in that marketplace if you're spending 3 days and you're just a beginner. I think you probably need to spend a little bit more. All right, so the next tier is 4 days per page. Once you get to that range, we're not really talking about any other industry except for the French comic book industry, where you are trying to create one of those, highly detailed, very big 8 to 10 panel per page books, right? French album that's highly detailed, right? That's a good example of the page, right? Backgrounds everywhere, awesome action, everything's drawn nicely, everything's drawn perfectly, the lighting's figured out, right? There's planning involved. A lot of the most talented European artists are going to do extensive planning. They're going to plan out the tonal and color layout of the page potentially. If you're a beginner, then I think, again, that's probably a good place to aim for. If you're looking to try and build your ability to create those big pages, spending 4 days is a really reasonable sort of thing to do, because, again, if you go to the next tier, which we'll talk about later, where you are spending the full 5 days per page, then again, what you often find is you start blowing deadlines, because again, stuff comes up in your life, and you often don't actually have the full sort of 5 days to do it. You're going to have a full day to kind of lay out the page, figure it all out, get your reference. You've got a full day to kind of like draw it all out. You've got a full day to sort of ink it, do the lines. You've got a full day to color, right? There's enough time there to kind of really think about it, make sure it's awesome, correct mistakes, right? There's plenty of time there to create a really good page and work towards it. Have time to build your skills if you're a beginner. But again, still, if you're beginning and you're really trying to aim for that higher level, you're probably better off trying to spend a little bit more time, which is the next tier, right? The full sort of 5 days per page. Obviously, if you are spending 5 days per page, you're going to be able to create, an even better page than, if you, spent 4 days. But again, at that point, it's like, the differences are going to be sort of minor, but often it's those differences that will make the difference to your ability to really sort of reach the audience, right? Because in all of these industries, you're competing against other artists essentially, right? And not in a real competitive sense, but what you're trying to do is kind of make sure that when people see the page that you're creating on the shelf and they're looking to buy it, that they kind of feel like, oh, this is not rushed, right? This is the sort of level of quality that I've come to expect. And you're often just competing with other people who are, probably more further along and more professional and can sort of get more out of 4 or 5 days. The thing I would say though about, trying to spend more than sort of 5 days per page is that I don't think you really need to. There's plenty of time in there. Even if you are sort of learning and developing, there's plenty of time there to, get good at the drawing, work on your construction, right? Improve things, correct errors. And one of the things I sort of found, you can't really spend much more than that and expect to kind of be a working professional artist in those industries. And when I sort of had to, do my first sort of tests for working in the French comic book industry, they were very explicit about, like, you've got a week, right? Week from this day, you need to show us a page and it needs to be sort of amazing, right? They didn't want to deal with anyone who was going to take longer than that, because again, I think they sort of know, your publishers and editors know that if you take longer than that, then you're probably going to blow the deadline way out. So it's important for that industry that you're able to create something within that week. Now, again, the reason for that is simple. Your typical sort of French album has about sort of 46 pages per album, and one comes out per year. That's why that sort of 1 page per week schedule exists. Again, hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about, what you can expect to be able to create in a particular amount of time. Again, I think the most important thing is that you're happy with the work that you're doing, which can be a real challenge with comics because, as I said, it is a game of compromise. Every comic book artist out there, no matter how good they are, would be able to do a much better job if they had more time. But it's always a matter of time versus money versus publishing expectations within that particular industry. And you're always kind of limited. You're always having to compromise. And it's important to pick the level of detail, the stylization that really makes you happy. Some people want to spend a whole week on a page. And for some people, I think that would be very sort of boring and laborious. Some people may just want to really work in that 2 to 3 hours per page, just crank out a giant sort of book. And even if it's a bit rougher, a bit more stylized, again, it could have color, not have color. That's all a matter of your process and what you're able to fit in that particular amount of time. This is a very personal thing, and I think you should view it that way. But I think that just experimenting a little bit with different sort of time frames and seeing how they feel is a really good idea. If you set yourself a time for, 2 hours or 3 hours to do a page, there's a pace to that, right? But there's an excitement to that. And you either like the excitement of being like, oh, in a few hours I'm going to have a page finished. That's awesome. Or you kind of just feel crushed by the fact that you're not going to be able to create great art in that amount of time. Again, a lot of it is about how you approach comics. Are you interested in the story? Do you want to create, these timeless, amazing pages that people are going to be able to look at in 100 years and sort of marvel at how you did it? Or do you want them to just sort of talk about the story in your book? Again, these things are personal and they're worth meditating on, because if you find the right mix, it can really make your career a lot easier. Because I think when you find that mix of pace versus output versus creativity, and that matches your sort of view of the world, your level of patience, I think that's when you're much more likely to find your groove with comics and really enjoy the process. And I really hope that happens, because drawing comics is super fun if you can find a way to make it pay and find a way to do it all day, every day. That's all I got. Catch you around. Happy drawing.